So David, welcome and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with the Xoogler community today.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. And thanks to you and Kush for setting this up, but for everything you do for the community. I know there's a lot of folks who work on it. And it's been, I knew a little bit about it, and it's been fun to learn more about it. And it's just great to see a few familiar faces, some of whom I haven't seen in a long time, and meet a bunch of new folks. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Why don't we start with your story of how you ended up at Google? Would you mind talking about your past history and then how you ended up there, and talk perhaps a bit about your time spent at Google and Facebook to kick us off?
Sure. So you mentioned a little bit of my background. I had worked at U.S. News and World Report, which was a news weekly magazine back when people read such things here in the U.S. And then I had actually worked at the Treasury Department for 3 years, and then went out to Stanford to get my MBA. And as I was wrapping up, I went out there because this was 2000 to 2002. So I was just really fascinated by what was happening in technology and happening in the Valley, and really had no exposure to that, and knew that I wanted, in addition to just getting some fundamental education in business, wanted to, get exposed to that. And so was looking around for a job in tech. And this was, I guess 2, or if we put now, depend how we define things now, 2 or 3 economic downturns ago. So it was a bad time to be coming out of school and looking for a job. I think as Knapp's question, if I can call you that, indicated, it's there are advantages and disadvantages. So anyway, it was a bit of a tougher economy than it had been in a while. But I ended up, Google was just getting started with AdWords and with real revenue product. And I had no background in the ad industry, but they were looking, as Google certainly did then, I think tends to do, look for, people who are motivated and with talent. And it happened, during my time at Treasury, I had worked for Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary at the end of the 90s. And I had been the deputy chief of staff, and Sheryl Sandberg had been the chief of staff, and she went over to Google. And so she ended up saying, hey, I've started working on this new business called AdWords. I think it's going to be a big thing. You should come join. And so I met a bunch of folks and ended up joining. And, I guess the thing that I would say, looking back, we can get into this a little bit more, but that was interesting was just how, what now you look back, and I tend to describe AdWords as, I feel like, the greatest business model ever invented. I mean, if you look, this is a simplified summary, but, the core functionality of the product when it launched is really unchanged today. And there's just such incredible alignment between, the user experience, what businesses are looking for. And of course, it accrued a lot of value to Google as well, and continues to this day. But, that was not obvious at the time. It was actually surprisingly hard to sell people, to actually convince people, businesses, that they wanted this product. One of my good friends ran a bunch of, he was on the finance side, but for a bunch of hotels, for whom, travel, hospitality, those kinds of things, great product. This is before that we were public and there were any norms in place. So I offered him all of these free advertising credits, like thousands of dollars in advertising, because I was like, your team should be using this. And no one wanted it. They were like, no, thanks. And then meanwhile, a few years later, he's like, we're spending millions of dollars a year. We were idiots. So it was really about scaling, the first launching that, scaling up. I think there were a couple of dozen people maybe in the organization I joined when I started. And by the time I left a few years later, there were many thousands of people, or 8 years later. And then went over to Facebook to basically, I'd been running the online sales channel, which was kind of there was the direct sales team, which I think you worked on, and then an online channel who worked with like small and medium businesses up to from mom and pop shops up to large businesses. And the opportunity at Facebook was to run the whole business side. And it was clear to me, having been, in the market and working in this industry for a long time, that, things were starting to take off in Facebook and they were getting traction. There was a good opportunity. It was good career growth for me. And so I did that for 11 and a half years and left about a year ago, and have been taking the last year or so to do some personal investing and advising, and some time off, and enjoying some time away with family, and kind of figuring out what I want to do next. So it's been, which is a real luxury to do, and been a fun experience.
Awesome. Thank you for the background introduction, David. Quite a few people were asking about the differences between your time at Google and Facebook. You've had the chance to work closely both with Mark, but also Larry in the early days, right? Can you
Yeah.
share about your experience of how how they're different and the experience of both of working for both CEOs?
Yeah, I think it's important to preface, and I think people will get this on this call, but I get this question a decent amount, and I always like to start it by saying, if you charted out like the Fortune 100 or any large companies in the world, on almost any axis, any variables, Facebook and Google are going to be pretty close on a bunch of things. Like compared to most big companies, they're nimbler, they can move faster, they take more risk. There's a whole bunch of things that are common. But that said, when you actually spend years working at both of them, you tend to notice a bunch of differences too. I think the thing, I guess maybe one thing I would say up front is one of the hardest but most liberating adjustments in coming in my time at Google was just this spirit of risk taking. And you asked about Larry specifically. I think just understanding how differently he saw the world. I mentioned I spent the first part of my career in the East Coast as a journalist and working in government, which is a very risk averse world and certainly culture and environment. And it's like, if you make a mistake, it's really, it can be really bad, even if it's a fairly inconsequential one. And so, understanding, I guess, a couple of things. One, just the rejection of conventional wisdom, that was certainly one of the things that stuck out to me. And that was a little bit hard to get my head around. And, having gotten an MBA, which to some degree teaches conventional wisdom and things like, well, you benchmark a bunch of times. And Larry wasn't so interested in like what every other business has done, because he was like, I don't want to do what everyone else has done. I want to just do something completely different, which at first was hard because you're like, well, I have all these frameworks and ways to approach problems. And, but then once you kind of realize it's much more liberating, particularly once you get your head around the fact that you don't want to make mistakes, but there's a much higher tolerance of mistakes. And so that was really fun. And to appreciate that and the risk tolerance. And I would say, with Larry, I think there was like such a rejection of conventional wisdom. It sometimes was infuriating, where you're like, okay, actually these things are like, I'm pretty confident, we can do. And there was just such a skepticism of, and this is true of Larry and Sergey, and, they were, along with Eric, were running the company at the time. And so there were a lot of things that were pretty similar, but I would say one of the things that really stood out to me about working with Mark at Facebook is, again, a lot of similar tendencies, but I think in some ways, he always struck me as more of a student. He was tough to convince. He had points of view, but my experience was he constantly kind of knew what he didn't know. And so he was always looking to learn and absorb. And, one of the, like for my interview when I was, I knew Cheryl there. I knew a bunch of people because they had hired a bunch of execs from Google. So I knew a bunch of the people there. But I didn't know Mark. I met him a few times, didn't really know him. But, what was interesting to me is he spent a lot of our interview, and we probably spent like, I think it was like 2 hours, but was mostly just asking me questions about what I'd done, but also like how the industry worked, about advertisers, about agencies, how decisions were made. And, I think he was trying to understand how I think and what I'd done. But it also was interesting to me, and I've seen him do this a million times since, is like, he's just using it as an opportunity to learn and push and question. And so, a lot of things that, I think at the time then he was 24, he's 36, 37 now, but just how much he learns. And I think that's a great quality in a leader as well. Like the questioning everything, the willing to take risk, really valuable, but also this ability to know what you don't know and be willing and always in this mode of say like, okay, this is great. Like each chance I have to meet someone new and different is a learning opportunity. And, that's certainly something I try to do in life as well. And so, I think that was a difference. Certainly at the time I came, Google was very much in this try everything mode, and Facebook, that say the two big differences I found was much more narrowly focused. It's a little hard now after all these years, like Meta does a hell of a lot more than it was at the time. But at the time, like there was much more of a discipline of, you were going to stay focused on your key goals and maybe not expand into all sorts of new areas. They've certainly expanded a lot more since then. And that was one. And two, there was a less centralization. Again, I'm not sure Google was centralized compared to a lot of places, but to get permission to do things at Google, I had to usually run through a lot of internal traps. And at Facebook, for better or worse, I was left, I think, to had a lot more autonomy, which I enjoyed and I think worked out pretty well. But I guess those are the things that jumped out to me about the companies and some similarities and differences.
Thank you, David. And just one final question to push you a bit more on that front. Quite a few people who are joined today are founders, and you had a great opportunity to see what worked at Google early on, building OSO, and then going to Facebook when it was really early. Can you share more about what you did differently scaling Facebook's ads teams compared to what you did at Google?
Well, I guess I would say, there were a bunch of learnings that were great. It's for me, when I'm looking at roles, I think the ideal thing for me is that I'm bringing some things to the table, some knowledge, and then there's a bunch of stuff I don't know because, I find the steep part of the learning curve really motivating. So I think the how to build and scale teams, hire, open new offices, enter new markets, I learned a bunch of that. But I think a lot of the differences, frankly, Chris, were driven by, the products being different, right? On some level, it's the same. You're selling online advertising, right? So it's the same industry, a bunch of commonalities. But one of the things that was, I can say now, interesting, and I would say really challenging at the time was, I talked about how good Google's business model was and like the product market fit for AdWords. Facebook's ad products, when I got there in 2010, they were growing nicely. Like if you looked at the metrics, you would say, okay, this is pretty good. But if you actually said, what are they selling? Like Google was like, hey, I'm looking for running shoes. I search for running shoes. I buy running shoes. Pretty clear, like value creation, value distribution. Facebook was like, hey, we have 400 million people on our platform at the time. You can buy a little box on the side that's an ad, but it wasn't really in the direct response business game at the time. We got there in time. And so, we had a bunch of advertisers who were buying ads because they were like, well, 400 million people, a lot of younger demographics are on Facebook. That's good. But how was value created? How did it drive transactions? So there was a lot that needed to be done to actually understand measurement, to actually revise and reform the ad system the way it worked, the targetability, measurability, and of course, and somewhat famously or infamously, we didn't have any mobile products, and that was like turned out to be problematic and be pretty stressful, and eventually turned into a problem that turned into a great opportunity and a great driver of growth once we got it right.
So as you joined Facebook, I'm sure Mark and Cheryl and everyone else was expecting you to do so many things at once. And then as your teams grew, there were more and more questions asked of you or things that people needed you to help answer. Could you share more how you actually decide on different opportunities, any guiding principles or frameworks that you use that could be helpful for us to learn?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, I always start with the people first approach, which sounds very like buzzwordy or something HR would say. But I mean, in the sense that if you hire great people, it's not gonna solve all the problems, but it's obvious, all of the things that we got done and that we solved were done by a team of people. None of it was done by me, right? I was there alongside a lot of people. So I think I always try to figure out, when you're facing a problem, who has either good knowledge to help answer this, like responsibilities or ideas, and get input that way. And Google certainly in those early days, put a ton of effort into hiring. And I think a lot of the things that the company focused on, the intent was right, which is we want to get the very best people. I think some of the practices may not have been right, which is sort of interesting looking back, and I think Google has learned and corrected and even been pretty public about, here's how you find exceptional talent and, avoiding stereotypes like school or GPA. But I think the focus on, starting, I always try to as a framework, understand, okay, what is the problem? Who is in a good position to solve it or have information or ideas? A couple of the other things that I try to use as a framework or as frameworks or as a process, one thing that I do and that at times has infuriated my team, but is, do we have to decide now? like when there's a crisis or when there's a problem, you want to solve it. You want, and you want to make a decision. Sometimes you're like, okay, we know there's a problem, let's make a decision. Sometimes that's right. Probably the majority of time it's right. But sometimes it's like, okay, are we going to learn more information in a month? And do we need, are we going to, is there a downside to waiting? And sometimes the answer is no. And I say this not because it's like the majority of the time, but I'm also, it feels like when there's a problem, people usually feel like there's a problem and we need to decide now. And sometimes you're better off actually waiting, of saying like, okay, if we wait a month, 2 months, or if we do a certain exercise or certain set of analyses or, you know, whatever it might be, we actually might be able to make a better decision at some period of time down the road. So the first thing I tend to push is like, okay, when do we need to decide and why? You know, that said, if you're not going to get any new information, like you're better off and you have a crisis, you should make the decision. So, you know, sooner or later, and hopefully sooner, you're going to get to a decision point. But I do like to, you know, make sure that you can make the most informed decision. And then, you know, it's just sort of weigh the options. And you know, and then I think once a decision made is have clarity about who owns what and communicate the decision. Because I think that's one of the things that I actually am sort of shocked by over the course of a career of seeing, you know, you can have really good teams, managers, individual contributors who can be terrible at communication. And it turns out it, you know, you can make the right decision, but if you don't communicate it, that can create all sorts of other problems as well. So, you know, all of those things come into it.
And quite a few people here are now leaders themselves in their own organizations. What advice would you give them to make sure they do or don't do to be a strong communicator, David?
I think that like a couple of things, and I have to say, and some of you can probably attest to this, is I am not like a natural, or I would say gifted communicator. I've done a lot of it over time and I've gotten better and I've come to recognize the value of it. But I was, I think, pretty reluctant to stand up in front of the teams and to, I think, you know, I like to use my voice when I feel like there's a reason for it and not, you know, not all the time. That, you know, and I say that because as preface to this, to a couple of points, the first of which is it's almost impossible to over communicate. I sometimes find myself saying like, oh, I've said this thing before, or, you know, I want to say something new or different. And so the first thing I would say is like, it's particularly on the important things, if you need to be in a place as a leader where you feel like you're saying the thing too many times, because you have to remember, first of all, people only retain a small percentage of what you say. So maybe you've said it to the right audience. Second, you talk to a lot of different audiences. They need to hear from you. Third, like a lot of companies, particularly fast-paced ones in tech space, make a decision, then change it at some point later. So you have to like remind people of things. I mean, that's point one on communication. Point two is I think I got to be a much better communicator once I internalized the point that like in an average, you know, let's say 30, 45 minute talk, frankly, you know, something like this, people are going to retain 10% if you do a good job, maybe 20% of what you say. And so I used to always want to be like very precise. So if I was talking about anything, I wouldn't want to make every point. And if there are some like exceptions to the rule, explain the exceptions to the rule. If you actually work backwards and realize, okay, people are only going to retain a few things, a better way to start is say, what are the key things I need everybody to know and understand? And then work backwards of like, okay, I want to deliver that message. I want to be really clear about it. And, you know, almost try to like rig the game so that you are able to set the like 10 to 20% of the things that people are going to retain. And that means sometimes being like short and punchy about points. It means setting really clear and memorable goals, repeating them in the ways that I talked about. So I think, you know, those are probably the most important thing. The third thing that I would say, and it depends on the size of the organization, but as you start to run bigger organizations, you also need like comms plans. And for some people, this is like incredibly painful to do. And some people enjoy it. But it's also the case if you have a lot of different organizations, you need to, like, if you have layers of management, you probably a good idea that if you have something you want to communicate, you need to talk to the management team so that when you go out and announce this to everybody else, and then people do what we all do, which is like when you're feeling insecure or uncertain, you go ask your manager. Well, if your manager's like, you know, whether they say these words or not, if they're thinking like, I don't know, I just found out about it when you found out about it, you know, then it's really hard to be as good a leader versus like, okay, maybe it's only I had a day heads up, but I was prepared. I got an FAQ or something. So there is like, if you're in a bigger org, a whole like science, little art, but like more science to getting this stuff right.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. As you look back during your time at Google, but also the early days of Facebook and then near perhaps the end of your time there, can you share more how you spent and prioritize your time? What can we learn from how you became a more effective leader? And what can we learn from those experiences? What did you do differently?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was in really in both places at Google and at Facebook. But, I always thought about like I had three main functions in the job. One was client facing. We had in both places, fortunate enough to have millions of advertisers. And, in the case of Facebook, by the time I left, we had like over 200 million businesses active on the platform, only 10% of whom, or less than that, were paying us, but, they were all clients. So you had to, spend a bunch of time working with businesses and clients or potential clients or, various external groups. But a third of the time, the time varied, but that was one function. A second function was around managing an organization. And a third was around the rest of the company. So it might be working, the folks I worked most closely with, the way Facebook was set up was, I was running like the whole business side, and there was a leader of the product and engineering side for all of the ads. And then as we expanded other business products, and, so spend a bunch of time with them, a bunch of time with the exec team. There might be particular issues we're working through, or maybe a regional thing if we're having a problem in, a certain place, or towards the end of my Facebook tenure. I spent a bunch of time working on India because we decided we need to invest more in India. And I had passion and some experience working there and so would spend a bunch of time on that, which brought me in touch with new teams. And then how I decide, okay, so those are the kinds of things you try to say, over a long period of time, maybe it's a third, but over periods of time, like depending on where you are, I might spend a lot more time. If we were having real difficulties where we didn't have we were trying to develop a new product area, then I would spend more time probably on the last piece working, with folks outside of my organization, but internal to the company. At times when it was like, okay, we've got a new area that we feel pretty good at, or a new product or a new feature, and it's like, we've got more go-to-market function, you might spend more time externally. And I believe in putting COVID aside, or now that we're coming out of it, hopefully, traveling more, meeting teams, meeting clients, then you're going to focus on certain areas. But you try to assess and understand what are your top priorities now and for some period of time, and make sure that your time usage is aligning with that. But it's gonna ebb and flow based on, I think what the particular needs at the time are. At least it did for me.
Sorry, are you able to hear anything I'm saying? I realize I've been talking with hardware mute.
Let's continue, David.
And I can hear you very well now too. Great.
Okay. So, David, you mentioned the transition to mobile was a big deal. And I think all of us who were in the industry back then will recognize, whether you were at Google or Facebook, how important it was. Were there other critical career moments that we can learn from? And how did you really use those as opportunities to advance your career and what you did?
Yeah, I think, there's been so many of them over time. I would say, one of the shift to mobile was probably the most stressful period I had, and difficult in the sense that it was clear that we were way behind the curve. Just as an aside, one of the things that was interesting is that I mentioned the desktop environment. When I came to Facebook, there was I'm looking at my laptop screen now. And so you had like a newsfeed, and off on the side, there were boxes. And it was not just that was the layout of the page. It's kind of like, that's how the company was set up, is like teams building this. And then you kind of had like ads related teams off to the side. So their products weren't integrated. And to pull off mobile, it wasn't just you had to figure out how to put ads in newsfeed. That wasn't that complicated. It's how to do it well, how to integrate teams, how to think more holistically about what we did. And, I think to the how do you build teams and how do you lead organizations? One of the things that I think is critical is getting that right level of, I talked earlier about autonomy and enjoying autonomy, but if I'd been so autonomous, I hadn't been integrated and didn't have a sense of what was going on in other parts of the company, what priorities were, I probably wouldn't have, I would have not been as effective a leader. So you need to like find that right balance. Other times, I mean, we talked a little bit about economic cycles, like ups and downs, when you find yourself, the first one I went through was 2008 to 2009 at Google, those periods when suddenly there's a pullback and you have to rethink things. And the worst scenario, sometimes you have to do layoffs or just revise plans or, it's always scaling back. Scaling up is never as big a problem, even if it can be intimidating and scary and uncertain. Those tend to be inflection points, and I think each of these things I talked about being in learning mode. And so, you get better at handling this and you realize it's going to be a fact of life going through ups and downs. I think, I would say certainly Facebook Meta has had its share of crises and, Google has, I think a lot of companies have, but certainly the Cambridge Analytica crisis, the outcry over that, 2017, 18 was really challenging just because it was a situation where there was a press cycle that got, it was a real problem. Some of the things that were alleged were in fact not true and were disproved, but that in some level didn't matter. There was a real problem with the contractual controls in our contracts were right, but the actual execution and what businesses were doing weren't always following those contracts, and those problems accrued to us. It wasn't like, oh, you violated a contract. That was like a huge problem for us. So that, figuring out how to manage their crisis, which was both fast decision making and reprioritizing, but it was also, there was a huge communication element to that. And again, looking back, there's a lot of things you could do better. But I think once we sort of figured out how to do that better, that was more helpful. I guess I'll stop there, but those are probably the top ones that come to mind.
Cool. Thank you, David. Let's dig in a bit deeper, but also expand on what Anthony was asking you at the start of this call. We just have the latest British Prime Minister resigned this morning. There's going to be more and more changes over the next few months. He had mentioned that we're probably going to be going to a recession. As a leader who's led multiple teams over the years over recessions and addressing the recessions, what advice do you have for all of us, or what should we be doing to prepare ourselves, our teams, the revenue of the business in advance of what we may be facing in the coming months?
Yeah, look, in general, you want to prepare for the downside and just always have a sense of, okay, if things don't go the way we thought, it's useful to be thinking that. But in a scenario like where we are right now, Anthony was right in that there can be great opportunities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. There are some businesses, to go to the other question we got around like customer acquisition right now, forget even if we were in a recession, just given some of Apple's changes, and it's much more expensive to acquire customers right now. And for some businesses, that means like they're not profitable anymore. And that's like an existential threat. So all of these things you have to look at in a recession. So, look, if you're an ads driven business, you can count on the fact that marketing budgets overall are going to be cut. Now, back in 2008, 2009, it was painful to be at Google relative to the other times at Google, relative to the few years before it and relative to the few years after it. But it turned out it was much less painful to be at Google than almost anywhere else, because in fact, while, forecasts, we had to reduce forecasts and the business was not going as well as it might have. Google was actually able to pick up share at the time because they were able to prove we're creating value. And in a world in which people were suddenly scrutinizing their ad budgets more, guess what? That is both an opportunity to prove one, if your product works, but two, if you can then go out and remind people and show people that your product works, that actually can be beneficial in the long run. That's a good, I want to be cautious because not everyone is in that position where either, they're in a place where they can clearly use this as an opportunity to grow their business in the long run. But there are those types of opportunities, and generally, like, you're probably starting up your companies because you believe the trends, the world is going in a way that either what you create and or the way consumer behavior is going to change, or business behavior is going to change, or however you're building your business to support, the trends are in your direction. And so sometimes if it accelerates things, there can be opportunities. I think you got to start by taking a sober look at where you are, understanding what the worst case might look like. I would say during COVID, for example, we went through some exercises at Facebook where the board looked at some of our scenario planning as it became clear that the pandemic was going to really was going to reduce a whole bunch of economic activity. And we got some push to say you really need to have more conservative plans. Like, what if the scenario turns out to be much worse? Now, it turned out it wasn't much worse. And our initial, I think, the exercise we did originally turned out to be good and helpful. But I thought the questions, even though no one wanted a worst case scenario, but I think being prepared for a worst case scenario makes sense, and you're going to be better off if you've thought about it and planned for it. So I think you always got to start there and then try to figure out, okay, if we're going to go through a contraction or at least like a slowdown of growth, what are our opportunities? What can we do? And, the best place to start is like not doing it's much easier to cancel things that you were planning to do than it is to, stop things you had already started doing, or even to fire people, frankly. So I think then, looking at what are the things that we can do if suddenly money's going to be tighter, budgets are going to be tighter, and refactor, maybe it's changing your product roadmap, but planning, being proactive about planning, or at least having a set of options, is going to serve you better, I think, even if it can be painful.
And as we start thinking about the downturn, there's quite a few people here perhaps are also job hunting. I'm sure based on your conversations with friends, with people who are coming to you to advise on the boards you sit, David, of different pockets of opportunities, whether at Meta, at Google. What advice do you have for people who are job hunting today, and where are the opportunities you've heard that people should be looking?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's obviously a tougher time. I talked about 2002 and when I was coming out of business school. This feels like it's another time, and I hope it's a short downturn. There's enough people I really respect in the world, including my old boss at Treasury, who is forecasting a more severe recession. We'll see where it ends up. But that's exactly as the question suggested. There are opportunities. I guess let me make one other point, which I think goes back to some of what Anthony was asking about. Look, if you're raising money right now, money is suddenly a lot tighter. If you're raising venture money, that's going to be tougher. But if you've raised some money, particularly if you're like early in your journey, if you only have like 2 or 3 months of burn, of money to burn, then you should be really worried about it. But if you're actually in a position which is like, hey, we always knew that it was going to take a few years to build this business. In some ways, now might be a better time because there's probably going to be less competition. There's going to be less new companies started because there's going to be less money flowing to companies. It may be easier to hire people. And this will come back to like advice to people. And like good ideas, that are aligned with the direction the world's going, or some currently unmet opportunities, are still going to be good ideas. So I think you tend to look back and realize that downturns, often there's some great companies creating downturns. If you're on the other side, if you're looking, then I think you just have to take a long, hard look at what you want to do, and job search should always start with that. And hopefully, if particularly if you have the luxury of having a job or like having an offer. But I always encourage people to figure out like, what do you really like to do? And where do you want to go? I don't mean that in the what do you want to be, when you grow up, or where do you want it to be in 10 or 20 years? I've never had good answers to those questions, but I've figured out, here are things that I like to do. Here are things directionally that I'd like to advance in for the next 5 years, maybe 10 years, if I have more clarity. And then make sure that when you're looking, there's a tendency, I think, sometimes to look at like, oh, I have job X, I work at Google right now, and I have an offer from this one place. Those are my choices. And it's like, okay, those might be your choices, or there's like everything else out there that, based on what you want to do, you may not have pursued yet. And so I think there may be a lot fewer people hiring, so you may not have the luxury of saying, I want to look at everything. But I guess the thing that I would encourage people to do is, really be thoughtful and deliberate and not just use the like particular choices in front of you as constraints. And then the last thing I would say is if you're able to rate people over everything else, working with talented people and good people you like and respect is great. And I think working with assholes, or in the worst case scenario, people who like, you don't trust either from an ethics standpoint or just that they're going to do right by you, that rarely ends well. So I would try to, I would really encourage you to consider whatever factors are important to you, but the people you're going to be working with is probably should be the number one.
And for those who are hiring still during this time, feel free to mention on chat or on the Xoogler Slack that you're hiring. I'm sure quite a few people here would love to chat with you as well. So let's try to support the community during this time. On the point of hiring, David, let's talk about how you hired over the years. Are there specific questions you love asking people or scenarios you like to put them through? Or how should people really find, if they don't have a strong referral, the best way to really hire the best candidates for specific roles?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say a couple of things. There's a bunch of questions I like to ask. I'm also cognizant of a couple of things that the research, which suggests that like we all bring biases and overestimate our ability to suss out in a 30 or even 60-minute interview what we know about someone and how good a hire they would be. And my own experience with, I think generally, like if I was to assess every person I've ever hired who I interviewed, I think my like track record would be pretty good. But I also have made some real mistakes where I thought someone based on interview was fantastic, and when I hired them, I realized I'd made a mistake. And all of that's a way to say that interview. I realized that it's a snapshot, it's a moment in time, but I tend to weight experiences, referrals much more heavily. Now, it's hard to do a good referral if you're in a hurry to do a referral. The problem with referrals is they typically happen as the last step. So it's like you've fallen in love with a candidate, you want to hire them. So it's like confirmation bias. You basically just want to call someone who's not going to say in 10 or 15 minutes, volunteer proactively, like, this person was terrible, don't hire them, So it's a little bit tricky, but that was like probably the number one thing that I do is try to use referrals a lot more and dig deeper. And if you take the time and you push and you get past the like, what could they do better? And that you kind of get one of the bullshit, like, oh, sometimes they just like work too hard and, didn't, and those types of things that aren't really questions. But if you go deeper and ask situational questions, I feel like you can tease these things out. So I think, don't maybe be a little more skeptical of what you're learning yourself. That said, what I tend to do is do a couple of things. One, ask some of the questions I just talked about when you do your own job search. I want to know what motivates people, what they love to do, what they don't like to do, because my own experience for myself, and I think for most people, is we do better at what we're motivated to do. All of us are going to have some things we have to do in jobs we don't like. Good employees will still rally to the occasion and do them okay. But, when you're doing something you love, it's that much better. So try to understand, what are the types of things you need and what motivates this person, or what are the things they really don't like doing. Then give a few situational. I think you can either do like, here's a scenario I'm struggling with, how would you handle this? Or, tell me about a time when you had a disagreement about a direction with somebody. It really depends. These should be customized to the job, and try to do those. And ideally, if you can then test what they tell you with a reference later, that's even better, to understand of like what you learned from the person and did that actually resonate with whoever did the reference. Those are probably the things that I would say I've come around to. But I think that degree of trying to fight on the bias of like, for whatever reason, falling in love or out of love really quickly with someone versus, look, we all have it. I don't think you can stop yourself from doing it, but if you catch yourself, or if you can at least be like, okay, I know I'm doing that, or I know I have that tendency, but I'm still going to like power through and be open to reconsidering and keeping an open mind, that I think can help solve a bunch of this.
Thank you for such great technical advice, David. I know that's the hardest thing we all do as leaders is hiring people. So appreciate the insights on what we should be doing more. A lot of questions were submitted around the ads industry. Given someone in the forefront of the ads innovation in the piece, can you share more about what you expect from the industry and what folks here who perhaps are entrepreneurs should look at developing for the ads industry going forward as well?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a bunch of things going on, and I know we're a little short on time, and I don't want to geek out and go too deep on something that that I care about. Not everyone will, but I would say, let me say a couple of things. One, I think there's a bunch of exciting trends going on, and connected TV is seems like that's, I suspect we're all using apps and connected TV in one way or another. But I think certainly from an ad standpoint, not just Netflix getting into this business and Disney and others, but it seems like the alignment of technical capabilities with a real focus on that from players who either weren't using ads or maybe were more in sort of a legacy older model. So I think that's interesting. It's also just interesting to see, like, Uber announced the other day that they're going to start putting ads in their apps. It felt like a couple of years ago there was this like, oh, ads are bad, no one should want to have ads. And the reality is, I mean, I think ads are a great business model because they enable you to either subsidize a product or offer a free product and make money that way. That doesn't mean all ads models are good or all ads are good. We've all experienced bad models and bad user experiences. But it's interesting to see the way it's growing. The things that certainly were top of mind for us at Meta, and I think I'm sure top of mind for a lot of people in the digital space, are just the changing privacy landscape. Whether or not you agree with a bunch of Apple's assertions, and I disagree with a lot of them, it doesn't change the fact that they control a platform and they've made some decisions and they've put some restrictions and limitations in that have made it much harder. And for a lot of businesses, particularly smaller businesses and startups, and including a lot of direct-to-consumer businesses. So I think, look, that's going to favor incumbents. Like, it's good to be Amazon for a bunch of reasons, including there. Probably will help Google out. Certainly will help Apple out. So I think those models have to evolve. And again, I'm going to try to resist going into the weeds, but I think the idea of how you can have new, stay consistent with some of the new privacy guidelines or things like aggregation, anonymization, but still provide the kind of targeting, and probably not quite as good, but at least decent targeting that's going to help smaller, more niche businesses find an audience the way that you could pretty well a few years ago. I think those problems, I don't think they're going to be ever solved in the way that it's, acquisition costs, customer acquisition costs are going to go back to what they looked like for some business a few years ago, but I think they will get better. And how that's done, one, I think there'll be a bunch of companies created, because it's hard for me to believe that a Google or Facebook or a Microsoft or an Apple can solve this for the whole industry themselves. I think there'll have to be some independent players who do that. I think, which will be, I hope there are good solutions that come along soon, because there are a lot of people who are being who are having trouble starting businesses, and it's affecting a lot of startups. And I think the industry will continue to evolve, and it means that, like, if you have the option to have first party data that you can protect but have access to, that's a much better place to be. And I think that's going to be much more valuable, which is why I made the comment I did about Amazon. They're in the position that they have so much first party data, they don't really need to worry as much about what they may or may not be able to get from a third party standpoint.
I'm going to ask a specific question for one of our colleagues here. He's building an ad startup in the metaverse. So one, would love to get your thoughts on that first of all. But for folks who have questions, feel free to start typing them. I've got a couple of more questions to run through, and then we'll go through the submitted questions. So David, in terms of your time clearly at Meta, but also now, do you think there are great opportunities for advertising the metaverse, or are we still too early?
There definitely will be great opportunities. It's pretty early, and I have to confess, I'm not a gamer, so I understand, and I've played some of the games, but I'm not one of the people. I mean, there are people who are spending a lot of time in the metaverse for gaming or for other reasons, and so I can't speak as much from for myself, and I've been gone from the company for a year. So I would worry about being too early, but I also, I think the opportunity is definitely going to be there and probably be a pretty big one. I would expect the companies like Meta to also have offerings in this space. So I think, you got to make sure there are ones, when I talked about first party and third party data before, that, you feel like you can compete. But yeah, I imagine there will be opportunities there, and I think it's just time and consumer behavior properly. Like, my own take is it's going to take quite a while and I think Meta has been pretty public talking about their expectations for it to really, it's getting some good traction relative to a few years ago, but to like really take off, it's probably a few more years to come.
So you had mentioned that you decided to take time off last year, but can you share more about your decision? When did you realize it was time to move on from Meta, and what have you been spending your time on, and what are you going to be doing next?
Yeah. So for me, it was, I mentioned before that I talked about the ways that I, assess opportunities and the steep, really loving the steep part of the learning curve. And I think, there were still plenty of things that I was learning all the time, but I felt like I had, gone through a lot of learning cycles. And I realized, for me, there were a couple of things. One, it was probably time. I'd been at Google 8 years. I, ended up at Meta 11.5 years. But as I was thinking this through, I sort of feeling like, okay, maybe it's time to, try something new that's going to throw me back into that steep part of the learning curve and a little bit of the scary place where, there's a lot you don't know. I'd also set a goal internally back, I think 2016, for our teams around, look, I always talked about revenue was just a reflection of how much value you're creating for businesses. Because if your ads products don't work, businesses will stop spending with you, and your ads, your value will go down. So you need to think about it that way. But to my point earlier about like having a clear message that people can understand, I set a goal that we should build $100 billion business by 2021. The idea being like, if we can create value, and it was at the time the forecasts were that we, would be somewhere well south of there. And the idea was, and I had a whole speech that went with this. I'm not going to bore everybody, but it was kind of like a good crisp goal. So to the point about communications, and talked about like maybe resetting our sights a little higher than where we had, and think about like, what are the things that we need to do or create to set ourselves up for like in a 5-year scenario. So once I set that, and I told myself I want to see that through. But as we were coming up to that goal and getting there, I also said this is a good time for me to step back. So I just, I felt like for me it was like the right time towards the end of 2021 to leave. I spent a bunch of the past year, besides doing a bunch of fun things and away from work, the thing that's been really liberating is I've actually done like lots of meetings, catching up with friends, meeting new people. Sometimes it's people being like, oh, hey, either I'm an investor and I'd love you to meet this founder, or just friends who've started companies and offering advice. And realizing I really have enjoyed that, of like, that earlier growth stage. And you realize that a bunch of the things that I've confronted, probably lots of us have confronted, are similar in ways to choices and decisions people are struggling with today. And so being able to offer some insight and some advice. So what I've sort of taken what I've been doing on my own, which is I'm investing in advising, and I've just signed on. I'm going to start in a couple of weeks, part-time, working with a group called 01 Advisors, which is a very small and like 2 or 3 year old venture capital firm that, raises funds, invests, but has much more of those sort of approaches, is less sort of saying, hey, well, you don't need to put us on your board. We don't really want to do that, but we want you to take our money, and, because you think we can help you with like how to build your company, how to do go to market. There's a particular focus on like, okay, you have a product, you need to build go to market. You have to like figure out who do you approach, who are potential customers, how do you build relationships, maybe get some introductions to that. So I'm going to start working with them part-time. I like the guys there. It was founded by actually 2 guys, one of whom is an ex-Google guy, Dick Costello, who was running FeedBurner back in, I think, 2007 when Google bought it. And then he ended up as the COO and as the CEO of Twitter for a bunch of years. And another guy, Adam Bain, who was the number 2 at Twitter. And so I'm going to go work with them.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Let's go to audience questions. Ashish, since you work for David, why don't you go first?
Hi, David. This is Ashish Agrawal. It's so good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
thanking you for hiring me into Google back in 2007, coming out of the internship program. So to my question, coming out of last year's frenzy, so a lot of institutions and funds have seemed to over allocated towards pre-product startups. And their current stand seems like they want to shore up their investments and prioritize later stage startups more so rather than pre-product. So do you have any advice for any new startup founders that are just starting out and are at the pre-product stage and are looking to raise funding? So in the current market, any advice, any thoughts that you have?
I guess, I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a big focus on shoring up, and there's, I'm not going to go into that just in the interest of time, but I guess what I would say is I think it's clearly harder to raise money, but I think there's also a recognition, and at least the venture capitalists I spoke to, and certainly the guys that I'm about to start working with, they're all also cognizant of the fact that there are great companies that are built in downturns. And so I think the things that I would be thinking about is, one, I think you're going to need to be patient. Like the stories of companies being able to raise lots of money, I would argue maybe even too much money at too high valuations, but like that's better than the alternative really quickly. I think that's going to be gone. But at the same time, so people are, I think investors are going to be a little bit more sober and probably move a little more slowly. Like those that I know, talk about they were investing at this pace, and suddenly, funds that they thought if they raise a fund that might last 2 or 3 years, they're suddenly like, oh, this is going to last 4 or 5 years. So I think that means like you need to be prepared to be patient, which means ultimately like, hey, if you have some angel funding, you might need to plan that that's going to last you longer than you expect, and plan accordingly. And I think the bar is going to be higher, so if it's like, there's a bunch of potential competitors, people trying to do the same thing and they've been funded, it's going to be harder. If you're going to a new space, that's a better place to be, but you might have to prove like, why is that space actually going to turn into a business? I just think everything is going to be harder. So I would say you've turned up the difficulty level, and that means maybe it'll take longer, but I would not say like it's a terrible time to start. If anything, I would say it's probably a better time to start. For the reasons I said, I think there'll be great companies minted if you can break through now, and there's probably be some really good talent available to hire. But I would say to have a sense of what you're getting into and realize it might be a little bit tough.
Why don't we get Aditya to ask the last question, since he had also worked for David?
That's a good way to end. Yeah.
Hey, so David, you earlier touched upon looking into where the world is going when you're trying to look for a job. From a startup point of view, I'm just trying to get your views on what are the big trends you see which are going to be huge in the next 3 to 5 years, and also trends which are nascent today but will be huge in next 10 to 15 years.
Oh, I mean, see, this is, now you understand why I called him the professor, and it was meant as a compliment, because you think big, which I've always liked and respected. I guess what I would say is that is such a broad question. I think there's going to be innovation in any and every way. And, part of what I'm excited about and my own goals right now, when I talk about like that part of the learning curve, is to dig in and probably go deep and pick a couple of areas that I'm particularly passionate about. And I don't feel like I'm yet at a place to really have that level of understanding. But I mean, I would just say, look, I think, I talked earlier about the ad industry, and I was just talking to a friend and a former colleague who's starting a business to do some of what I talked about a few minutes ago, to try to confront, in a world in which how data is used is going to change pretty radically, or it has already changed pretty radically. Like, what are the new models that need to be built? I think that's an interesting and important area, especially as more and more businesses are going into the ads business and seeing it as a strong revenue line. We talked about the metaverse. I think, I think what's happening with respect to financial services is really interesting. I mean, Web3, but beyond Web3, I just think like, I'm also a believer in like there's going to be a lot more democratization of capital. I think the whole DAO investment thing is really interesting to me. But I think like the reality is I think there's a million things going on, especially when you give yourself a 5 to 10 year horizon. And so I think a good strategy, whether you're doing this full time or even if you have some passion and like on the side to whatever you're doing, you like to do some investing in startups or in public companies, is find a few areas that you're passionate about and spend a bunch of time and try to go deeper, because I still think there's plenty of information asymmetries out there and opportunities, particularly for the kind of smart people who are in this network to find things and have an opportunity. And like one of the things that I would say is as a final thought, you know, which goes back to what I said about like Larry's philosophy on life, where I came in with this like probably too healthy a respect for conventional wisdom and benchmarks and like what people had done before, is you realize like as you go through life and you get older and is that there's just people trying to do their best, but so many of these areas are like there's a lot that's understood, or people who haven't done like every level of analysis. And so if you have like smart people who are passionate about it, you can usually find an advantage. So I would just really encourage you to ask yourselves those questions and then choose some areas and go deep and, you know, and hopefully have fun and maybe find some profit in it.
Thank you, Professor Duda. and David, why don't we close out with how can the Xoogler community be helpful to you?
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm about to jump into a new world, you know, focusing like on VC and Series A and B investing. So if you have ideas or if you have a company, I'm happy to hear about it. And look, I'm just a, you know, believer in trying to help people. Plenty of people have helped me on the way to in my career who had no interest in it other than just being, you know, generous with their time. That said, you know, I don't think I can answer, you know, hundreds of things and do everything, but I'm happy if I can be helpful based on something I've done or with a connection or with an opportunity. I'm just david.fischer@gmail.com. Advantage of having been there when Gmail started, you get a good Gmail address. So, you know, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, David. Sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but you got David's email. That's even better. Thank you for contributing to the Xoogler community, David, and wish you all the best in your new role. And thank you everyone for joining today's call. We look forward to seeing you at our next Xoogler event.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chris. It's great to see everybody. Take care.
See you soon.